This episode of Trifles is made possible by listeners like you who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the problem was final, the house was empty, and his bow was last, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Why would the Pope engage Sherlock Holmes' services? Why did he receive the Legion of Honor from France? And why would he refuse a knighthood?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 388, Elderly in the Canon. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Now what do you say, old man?
I'll be along in a moment.
Coma. I go in and out of comas all the... French toast, please.
Perry Como, wasn't he a great singer?
Oh, boy. Well, this is a topic we haven't considered before, and now that we are into our 8th season, it's kind of surprising that we didn't hit on this already, talking about elderly in the canon, and what it means, where it was mentioned, etc. And it is inspired by a piece of work from Baker Street Journal from about 10 years ago or so. I think it was it autumn of 2014?
It was indeed, yes. Volume 64, number 3, autumn 2014, BSJ.
Yeah. Michael Pollock treating us to elderly in the Sherlock Holmes story. So should be an interesting discussion if you can manage to keep yourselves awake throughout the whole thing. Nod off and, just let those dentures hit the floor. Anyway, if you would like to support the show, you can do that at Patreon or Substack. We are available on both platforms. It's your choice, however you feel like you can add something or whatever platform works best for you. You can find us at patreon.com/trifles and trifles.substack.com. And of course, our homepage is still SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. We are available everywhere that you get podcasts. Wherever you happen to be listening to us, please make sure you're signed up to follow our show and tell someone else about it. Bring other Sherlockians along for the ride. That's half the fun here. Okay. Well, we are, well, I forget, Bert. I'm too old. What are we talking about again? Yes, this is something that's interesting because when you think about the Sherlock Holmes stories, Conan Doyle wrote them over the course of 40 years. Started out when he was a fairly young man, not too long out of medical school and trying to establish a practice for himself. Of course, we know that practice never came, and Conan Doyle turned to writing permanently. So by the end of the Sherlock Holmes stories that Conan Doyle wrote, it was in 1927, 40 years after he first began. So he was by no means a young man anymore, and certainly had an eye toward the elderly as well. So, where would you like to kick this off?
Well, I would like to just kick it off by locating it in history, because that's one of the things that I'm sort of always driven to for whatever reason. And it's interesting, when you get into, and we will, life expectancy and so on in Victorian England, but things that we take for granted today, in other words, the practice of gerontology or medical focus on old age was really not around in any significant or substantial way backed by peer research or a body of work in Victorian England. And in fact, a lot of it seems to have begun in the mid-Victorian period in Britain anyway, with a fellow named George Edward, who people have identified as the first gerontologist. And Day published, I think, in 1849, a practical treatise. It could be one of Holmes's monographs. George Edward Day, a practical treatise on the domestic management and most important diseases of advanced life in 1849. And apparently his sort of focus in there, among other things, was to construct some gerontological theories. And his work made the claim that women's aging was naturally accelerated. Now, this is sort of the typical Victorian assessment of women versus men. Women, their aging was naturally accelerated after the age of 40, and bases all this, of course, on outward appearance. And while women, said Day, begin to age around 40, men did not experience this, no, until they were in their 48th or 50th year. And, that's how he sort of defined declining old age. Well, leaping across to the Canon, and this is based on an article by Michael Pollock in this particular issue of the Baker Street Journal, Elderly as a Metaphor in the Canon. And he begins by quoting this line from The Empty House, which is a great place to start. Watson writes, he was an elderly man with a thin, projecting nose, a high, bald forehead, and a huge, grizzled mustache. His face was gaunt and swarthy, scored with deep, savage lines. It was a tremendously virile and yet sinister face, which was turned towards us. And that, of course, is Colonel Sebastian Moran.
And as fate would have it, Colonel Moran is only 3 years removed from stalking Sherlock Holmes above the Reichenbach Fall. And, at his age, at his advanced age, Moran would have had to be just as spry and athletic as Holmes himself. and Colonel Moran, Michael tells us, is only 54 years old in The Empty House. And yet he still proves himself a deadly shot. And he's still strong. With convulsive strength, he seized Holmes by the throat. So, is it fair, then, to call him elderly at the tender age of 54?
Yeah. So something at work here is, something's at work here other than careless language by Watson or an ageist prejudice on the part of Watson. The Canon has its share of elderly people, and there are many loyal servants. So, for example, and other people, in The Hound of the Baskervilles, James Desmond, an elderly clergyman believed to be the next in line to the Baskerville fortune after Sir Henry Baskerville, is described as a man of venerable disposition and of saintly life. And then there's Mr. Sandiford of Reading, the one who sells Holmes the sixth and final bust of Napoleon, an elderly, red-faced man with grizzled side whiskers, who, very fair, he wants to make sure he's not taking advantage of Sherlock Holmes. But these are all exceptions to a different rule. Everywhere in the canon, or at least most places in the canon, elderly is most frequently used as a pejorative. So you have a number of villains described as elderly, which is a word that apparently is intended to evoke cunning and decrepitude of some sort, if not of body, then of morals. And a number of lesser so-called elderly characters are depicted as quite foolish.
Yeah, well, of course, we have the elderly Professor Coram in The Golden Pince-Nez. He was, of course, bedridden. He was very frail. And Holmes, as he was making an inquiry about the case, he said, "An elderly man, I presume, about 60, but his constitution has been shattered by his life abroad." And then we have.
Well, that's not Professor Coram.
Oh,
that's,
you're right. That's
Turner
Boscombe Valley Mystery.
Mystery.
I'm slipping into the second half of the paragraph. That was Turner.
It's your advanced age.
Yeah, well, there you go. I'm Colonel Moran's age. So what can I say? No, that was the Boscombe Valley Mystery. That was Turner, who was said to be about 60, but his constitution was shattered by his life abroad.
Yeah, but age was no barrier to Turner. You know, he was tough. He had strong character. And Watson says there was an air of dignity and power to his appearance. But he was a murderer and in the grip of some deadly and chronic disease.
And, you know, this next one is interesting. In the Reigate Puzzle, or Reigate Squires, there are two Cunninghams, father and son. And the elderly Cunningham was really part of the aiding and abetting of what went on here. And of course, that included the murder of the coachman, William Kerwin. Now, the elderly Cunningham, quote, was advanced in years without being positively decrepit. Well, how's that for a compliment? You're advanced in years, but not positively decrepit.
Not yet decrepit, I see.
Yeah, because remember, he and his son ganged up on Holmes and tried to twist his wrist to make him release the document that he had a hold of that would give the game away. But here's the interesting thing. At the same time, we hear tell of William Kerwin's mother. Now, Kerwin wasn't that old, so his mother couldn't have been all that advanced, but she was mentioned as being very old and deaf, and we can get no information from her. The shock has made her half-witted. But I understand that she was never very bright. Maybe she was always elderly.
Isn't that interesting? You know, I was never really aware of this theme, of this sense running through the canon. And then there are more. There's the fake Russian nobleman in The Resident Patient, who's actually a murderer and one of the Worthington bank robbers. And there's Wilson Kemp, the giggling sadist, and the Greek interpreter who's described as both elderly and middle-aged, oddly enough. And then in The Solitary Cyclist, Mr. Williamson is described as a respectable elderly tenant. He's a defrocked minister, and he's the one who tries to force the sham marriage on Violet Smith and ends up with 7 years in the slammer.
Yeah, and of course we have Silas Brown from Silver Blaze. He was the trainer who, of course, disguised the horse. He is a fierce-looking elderly man, a perfect compound of the bully, coward, and sneak. Here's another interesting one. I hadn't really picked up on this before. I think we gloss over it because it's really just in the opening of the Red-Headed League that we find out that Jabez Wilson was mentioned as being a very stout, florid-faced, elderly gentleman with fiery red hair, obese, pompous, and slow. This not over-bright pawnbroker. But I had assumed, since he had bright red hair, that he wasn't yet considered elderly, but this is directly from Watson's pen.
Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? I mean, the agedness of so many of these people is many times unconnected to their appearance and their actions. and in some cases, like Colonel Moran, completely contradicted by them. So elderly seems to be used not as a description, but to signal some sort of character effect. And there's one great example of this. It's the line where we hear someone in a case of Sherlock Holmes say, "I flung the curtain aside and found myself face to face with a broad-shouldered elderly man who had just stepped into the room." That is Lady Brackenstall, who is inventing a non-existent robber and the murderer, supposed murderer, of Sir Eustace in the Abbey Grange. So here's someone who's inventing someone, and she comes up with, oh, by the way, he was elderly.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, and then there are, if you look around for younger evildoers in the canon, their descriptions differ from these other people in one significant way. And that is all of the younger wrongdoers of some sort or other have some kind of an excuse. So Jack Ferguson, who's in he's the one with the blowgun in the Sussex Vampire, he was spoiled by his clueless father. And in The Three Students, Watson tells us that Gilchrist had a father who ruined himself on the turf. Oh, dear. And then, what about Jeffro Rucastle's little boy Edward? I think it was Edward in the Copper Beeches. This is a clear case of like father, like son. And then there's Mary Holder, who steals the beryl coronet. Well, she was under the influence of her lover, George Burnwell. So, it's all of these people seem to have some sort of reason or some extenuating circumstance for their behavior.
It is interesting. And, I mean, whether it's very young or very old, the two extremes, that's where we see most of the extreme behavior. Not to say that there aren't other criminals here, but it's usually at those very tail ends. I think also of in the Retired Colourman with Amberley, who's said to be, I think, about 60 or so, the chest and arms of a Hercules. But boy, he had some character flaws. He married a younger woman who obviously did not care for him after a certain point, and was having an affair, and Amberley did what he did. But it's that, that grizzled hair, that really bad temperament, Watson lamenting that he was going to have to stay in a cheap hotel because, or go third class in the railway because Amberley wasn't going to spring for regular accommodations. You talk about elderly and being flawed. I mean, I think it's personified in the likes of Josiah Amberley.
Yeah, that is it. That is a great example. And, I mentioned earlier that we would touch briefly on life expectancy. And, of course, that's where all this comes from. Much of the increase in life expectancy that we've seen has come from reducing things like infant and child mortality, better nutrition, reducing deaths in childbirth, increased sanitation in hospitals and so on, better sanitation practices. But in the first decade of the 20th century, so this is 1900 to 1910, a man in England or Wales who had reached the age of 45, so if you made it to 45, you could be expected to live until about age 68. And a woman could be expected to live 2 years longer than that. And, a century later, we've improved those numbers by about 15%. So, I think today the average life expectancy of a man is about 78, let's say, 78, 80, and a woman's 80 or more. But I'm not a big authority on this.
Not yet. Well, one thing I did want to mention as part of this, comes from the wonderful introduction that Christopher Morley wrote for the Doubleday edition of the Canon in 1930. Morley writes, Doyle himself must have been a singularly lovable man. There's an anecdote in his Memories and Adventures that reveals very clearly the fine instinct of delicacy in his massive personality. He was visiting George Meredith in the latter's old age, and they were walking up a steep path to the little summer house that Meredith used for writing. And in Doyle's own words, the nervous complaint from which he suffered caused him to fall down occasionally. As we walked up the narrow path, I heard him fall behind me, but judged from the sound that it was a mere slither, and it could not have hurt him. Therefore I walked on as if I had heard nothing. He was a fiercely proud old man, and my instincts told me that his humiliation in being helped up would be far greater than any relief I could give him. And Morley concludes, I can think of no truer revelation of a gentleman than that. And to me, this shows Conan Doyle's great respect for the elderly. Certainly he was, older at the time when I'm sure this happened, but he appreciated someone's dignity and was willing to treat them that way. And I think it was just a very insightful thing. And that paragraph from Memories and Adventures always stuck with me.
Oh, I love that. Well, that's beautifully said and very apt. And, speaking of apt, we have in Sherlock Holmes someone who appears to have triumphed over the effects of age. The last time we see him in his last bout, he is 59, and then he is off. He's made a return from his beekeeping, but he is off in Sussex keeping bees. And it's perfectly understandable that he has no fear himself of aging because he's not dead.
Must be all that royal jelly that's keeping him alive.
I thought it was Welch's. Oh well. And that is just a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Well, I found the information I was seeking.
You found the name Williamson, which conveys nothing to my mind.
Well, we know he's elderly and respectable.
And therefore unlikely to be the energetic cyclist that sprints away from that athletic young girl.